Welcome back. Welcome back to another episode of the Basics of Balance. Hello, my friends. My name is Ariella. We are going to be talking today about a common question that I get when I'm working with a newer nutrition client. And I think this is something that a lot of people have questions or concerns about, and it is about how much protein you should be eating, really coming from a place of how we as, nutrition professionals or fitness professionals, how we arrive at the number in which we tell our clients to work towards. Okay. So how protein gets measured, how it gets calculated, because the thing is, everything about us could be the same, but we would still have different protein requirements because our protein intake is very personal to us, right? To who we are, what we're working towards. A lot of those different variables affect how much protein you should be eating in a day, right? And a lot of times, I think when I'm working with a newer client and I tell them how much protein I want them to start working towards, it sounds like a lot because arguably they don't really have any understanding of how much protein they are eating. And so they hear a higher number than what they were expecting. And they just like, it sounds like a lot. And so it must be a lot, right? Additionally, uh, we have just received new dietary guidelines over, how much protein we should be eating or working towards. And so these have just, been updated. However, not a lot of people know that because it's so recent. And also, number two, going based off of the old guidelines, that are much too low for reasons that we'll get into. So when they hear a higher number based on old information, but also the information that they have that says it should be much lower, right, than I'm giving them, then that's how we obviously come up with these preconceived notions that like what I'm telling you to eat is too high, right? And if you can't tell, I'm a big fan of understanding why something is important, okay? The more reasons that we understand why something is important, we're giving ourselves more reasons as to keep trying to prioritize things that might be difficult. But hey, if A, B, and C aren't a big enough reason, okay, we're going to lean on reason D to keep trying. You see what I'm saying? We're not putting all of our eggs in our basket. We are spreading the wealth, if you will. We are spreading the love. So, first of all, let's get into the old recommended daily targets for protein intake were 8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. All right. And so when we kind of convert that into pounds, that's 0.36 grams per gram of body weight in that, or I'm sorry, per pound of body weight. Blah. All of these numbers. And here's the thing that is to prevent deficiency in terms of keeping you alive. That is literally if you were laying in a bed and you were not moving, to genuinely just like sustain human life. And I don't know about you, but I'm not laying in bed all day every day. And if you have children, you're definitely not laying in bed every day. You're running after them. You're getting groceries, you're picking up car seats, you're doing more than just the lowest amount, if you will, okay? And we also need to keep in mind our protein intake is directly associated with not only creating a strong body in terms of strengthening our bones, making our muscles, get stronger, but it's also for cellular turnover. So nothing necessarily even to do with the skeletal system or our muscular system. We're talking overall health, right? Protein is the number one resource that is being used when we are sick, when we are injured. So that is something, sickness, something as trivial as the common cold, or maybe something like, hey, your body is fighting cancer. It's fighting a serious disease. Injury could be something like, hey, I tweaked my knee, or hey, I fell down, I fractured a hip, and I am trying to heal from this injury. See what I'm saying? So protein is massively important for a lot of different reasons. Doesn't matter if we're talking about, structural components or cellular components or physical goal components, right? And so the new guidelines are away from 0.8, we have increased, okay? And we now have a range. So the new guidelines are 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, all right? So it's a little higher, right? Arguably, that top number is double of what the old guidelines were. Okay. And again, a lot of that reason for that increase is because people are going based off those minimal guidelines and they are okay with minimal. And that's not promoting optimal health. That's not taking into consideration the fact that we lose muscle as we age, right? And so, past 30 years old, we actually need to actively be chasing more muscle because we're losing it as we age. So if we're trying to build more muscle, we're at least slowing that down, right? Because muscle is obviously metabolic gold. If you can't tell by listening to any of my episodes, or reading the news actually at this point in time, which I love. I love that things are kind of like turning a new leaf in the health and the fitness world. But anyways, it's not when we are increasing that daily requirement or those guidelines, it's taking into consideration health from a whole person approach, right? You're not just laying in bed. You have a life and you should be working out, right? Working out should be something that should be happening regardless if you have any physical goals. It is to promote optimal health as we age, right? We don't want to get into a situation where we're in our later years looking back and we're breaking down because we did not protect our muscle, because we did not strengthen our bones, because we did not eat enough protein, right? And so we're learning this information to protect us in the future, right? Almost like our insurance policy. Okay, so a few different variables as far as how protein gets calculated. Your protein requirements per day are largely going to be, yes, with those guidelines in mind. However, context matters, right? Which is kind of the whole entire reason as to why there are so many variables and factors as to how your protein targets get calculated. We might fall on the outside of that recommended daily target based on what you're working towards, right? What we have to work with, if you will. So, a few different factors. Number one, we have age, we have gender, we have weight, we have height, we have your goals, we have your activity level, and your type of activity. So, all of those factors, from a big bird's eye view, we're going to try to cover just to kind of give you, just again, some general information. Okay. If you are an exception to the rule, you're an exception to the rule. But generally speaking, w- age is going to be the number one variable because, as I mentioned earlier, we need more protein as we age when we are fighting back against that that age related muscle loss, right? Sarcopenia, as I mentioned earlier. Also, as we age, things are breaking down, for lack of a better analogy. And so we need to make sure that we are giving our body enough of the fundamental building blocks of what it needs for that cellular turnover to continue to improve our health, to fight against illnesses that might not pop up because you're eating enough protein, because you're healthy, right? To protect against injuries, right? That might not happen because you're strong, because you prioritize your protein intake. So your age is going to be a huge factor and what we use to calculate how much protein you need. Somebody who is younger probably doesn't need as much protein as somebody who is maybe a little bit older, right? um Next is going to be your weight and your height. A 200-pound person, just as an example, who is 6 feet tall is going to need significantly more protein than somebody who is 100 pounds and 5 foot tall, right? Like your weight and your height are partially what's going to dictate how much protein you need to eat. Now, your weight might also be something like your goal weight, right? So your goal weight is taken into account as well. And so, if you weigh 300 pounds and we're trying to get you down to, 150 pounds, well, we're not going to ask you to necessarily eat 300 grams of protein, right? Just for round number purposes. We might ask you to eat closer to your goal weight, right? Which would be closer to 150 grams, right? Just as a round example. Your gender. So, typically speaking, male is going to have a lower body fat percentage, just genetically speaking, and that also means they're usually going to have a higher skeletal muscle mass percentage. Okay, a lot of factors come into play with that, right? Like hormone levels, like they have greater testosterone, so they're going to have an easier time building muscle. Muscle is very metabolically active, and so it's keeping that metabolism super high high. You're not holding on to body fat as much, things like that, right? And females are usually going to be the opposite of that. Okay. Usually we have less muscle mass and we also have a little bit more body fat, right? We typically, we have breast, right? We have more body fat around our glutes, around our midsection, our thighs, things like that, right? And usually speaking, we are going to have a little bit harder of a time building muscle because opposite of what I just said about males, they have higher testosterone. We have a different, hormonal breakdown, right? And so your gender is going to come into play. Now, your goals, okay, as an example, your goals are going to be a massive contributor as to how much protein you need to eat. Somebody who is in a deficit, who is chasing fat loss, weight loss, who is dieting in a cut, whatever term you want to use, they are probably going to need a little bit more protein as somebody who is just trying to maintain their weight, somebody who is maybe trying to build muscle, okay? And that might be surprising to hear. And the reason is when we are dieting, we are intentionally not eating enough calories in an effort to lose weight, to lose fat, because that's how we lose weight and fat is by being in a caloric deficit. Well, when we're in a deficit, one of the areas of our body that's at greatest jeopardy is our muscle. Your muscle needs enough calories and it needs enough protein to just simply preserve, right? To fight against that age related muscle loss, right? We need to make sure we're eating enough of those two things. However, when you're in a deficit, you're not eating enough calories. We know that. We're intentionally doing that. Okay. And so, a way that we kind of want to fight back and to preserve that muscle so that your body doesn't, kind of lose that muscle a little bit faster than we wanted to in a deficit, keep your metabolism high, promote optimal health, things like that, is making sure we're eating enough protein. Somebody who is maybe on the opposite side of the spectrum, who is maybe in a bulk, in a caloric surplus, you're trying to intentionally build muscle, you are not necessarily going to need as much protein, but we definitely want to make sure that, hey, we're eating enough carbs. We're eating enough of our energy source to help our body recover from workouts that we are using to stimulate muscle, to build muscle, to build back stronger and to grow and things like that. And so you're not leveraging protein as much as you are leveraging things like strength training and, carbohydrate intake, calorie intake, things like that, right? um Moving on to activity level, your activity level, somebody who is super active, an athlete, is probably going to need a lot more protein than somebody who is more sedentary, right? And so your activity level is another variable determining, or that is determined to calculate your protein intake. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, protein is the number one resource that's being used when you're sick or injured. Okay. And so when we think about activity, we don't typically think about injury, right? Except for the fact that that's basically what's happening. Okay. When we are working out, when we are living an active lifestyle, for lack of just for sake of this conversation, think about activity as basically putting your body under stress and creating mini injuries. Okay. When we're strength training, micro tears in your muscles. When we are, doing plyometrics, like jumping a lot, we are creating tiny little, minuscule, but like stress fractures on your bones. And so basically, that activity alone is actually making you weaker. Okay. We get stronger from that activity by what we eat. And if we are not eating enough, well, hey, that's going to, put us at greater risk of not being able to recover from that activity and increase our risk of injury, right? Compared to somebody who is eating appropriately for their activity level and they are eating enough protein to help their body recover, right? Promoting that cellular turnover, that number one resource that's being used when we are sick or injured. Okay. It's helping recover from those mini tiny injuries, whether it's in your muscles, your connective tissue, your bones, whatever the case is, right? Injuries. And so somebody who is actively, or I'm sorry, somebody who is, working out, they're lifting 4 to 5 times a week, they're going to need more protein for that reason alone, you know? And comparatively speaking, somebody who is not necessarily moving as much, well, they don't have as great of a risk of those kinds of injuries. You know what I mean? And then the last variable that we're going to kind of talk about is the type of activity. All right. Somebody who is very active, but who typically does more cardio, they are going to have different protein requirements than somebody who is maybe the same level of activity. They work out the same amount of days, right? The same duration. So the same, like, someone working out an hour is maybe, running for an hour. That might be the same, but the type of activity might be different. A runner is going to have different requirements than somebody who strength trains. Okay. And so that is going to affect how much protein we need to eat. Somebody who is strength training is probably going to need a little bit more protein if they want to continue to get stronger, if they want to continue to make progress in their lifts, than somebody who is primarily focused on like an endurance sport, such as, running, like I said, a marathon. They are typically going to have, yes, protein requirements. However, we want to make sure that we are giving their body enough carbohydrates, which is your body's primary energy source, which you're using a ton of when you're running, which is why sometimes you need to have something in the middle of your runs to keep those energy stores high. And so, your type of activity is going to matter. And so I think, again, this is more just for our general understanding. When you are working with somebody who is telling you how much protein you need to eat, it's not just an arbitrary number, right? Like, you tell us what you are working towards. You tell us, this is what I'm trying to do. And based on all of that information, we take that into consideration, and we, make some, mathematical calculations, and we say, based on all of that, this is how much protein we need to eat. And it's not necessarily going to be the easiest thing if, trying to eat more protein is newer to us, right? However, the human body is a wonderful, unique work of art. And the more we do something, the better we get at it. And so it might be challenging initially, but each time we keep trying, each time we identify how to eat more protein by increasing the portions of what we're already eating, right? Before we even have to add in more protein sources. What are you already eating? Eat more of that, right? And the more, routine that feels, cool, let's build on that, and let's, start to add in new protein sources, right? The more understanding we have about why protein is so important, right? Like understanding the cellular turnover, the number one resource, why it's being, or that it's being used when we're sick or injured, fighting against, age-related muscle loss, and, things like that. And also, when the more understanding we have as far as how it's calculated, like I said at the beginning, the more reasons we're giving ourselves to keep trying, because it's not easy initially. But if we can keep trying, eventually that's going to turn from being really challenging and, man, I have no idea how I'm going to hit this number, to getting texts like I get regularly from clients who first told me that and said, I went over my protein. Is that okay? Because it's going to happen. And I say that to every single client who tells me, wow, that's a lot of protein. It's hard now because it's new. Eventually, it's not going to be hard. And before you know it, you're going to hit your protein without even realizing it. You're going to go over without even realizing it. And protein is no longer this massive hurdle in your fitness journey. And it's just simply a part of who you are. And so I hope that that kind of gave a little bit of insight in terms of, just some of the variables. Like I said, context always matters, right? But that is, generally speaking, what we are going to use to base how much protein you need to eat. If this was helpful for you, if you think this would be helpful for others, I would really appreciate if you could help me get the word out, help share the love, if you will. And of course, if you have not, subscribed, I would be so grateful for that as well. So let's keep this train moving along. Now you need to know a little bit more about why protein numbers are what they are. And until next time, friends, have a wonderful rest of your day.